In 1923, a sealed ledger was discovered beneath the crumbling foundation of an abandoned chapel in the South Carolina swamps. The ink was brown with age, but not from time. The handwriting was meticulous, a surgeon's precision. Every entry marked a name, and every name was followed by two numbers, an arrival date and an expiration. Local officials burned the ledger within 24 hours. No public record, no explanation. Only one page survived, ripped and smuggled out by a junior archivist who vanished 3 days later. That page, it bore the seal of a family that had been whispered about for over a century, a name that surfaced whenever a child disappeared, whenever a stranger's body was found drained of blood near Angel's Rest. Whitworth. Now tell me, how does a family build an empire of power, respect, and prestige, while slaughtering over 200 human souls beneath the altar of a church they themselves funded? This is not folklore. This is not fiction. You are about to enter the hidden history of America's most sinister dynasty, a story erased from textbooks, sealed by state archives, and ignored by religious institutions that still bear the stain of their gold. The Whitworth family were not mere murderers. They were architects of psychological control, designers of a theology so twisted, so persuasive, that their victims willingly walked into their own destruction believing it was salvation. You may feel the air shift as we move forward. This isn't just a tale of darkness. This is a map of how power operates, how it hides, how it spreads, how it sanctifies itself in scripture and charity, all while digging deeper into your mind. By the end of this story, if you're paying attention, you'll recognize the same patterns around you, in your government, in your church, in your very thoughts. Because the Whitworths didn't vanish, they evolved, and what you're about to hear, it changes a man. It reshapes the soul, not with fear, but with fire. So close the door, dim the light, because from here on out, we go deeper than history ever dares. Now let me take you to the year 1789, where the moss was heavy, the sermons were sweet, and death wore the face of an angel. While the ink of independence was still drying in Philadelphia, far from the gaze of founding fathers and idealistic patriots, another vision of America was quietly taking root in the marshes of South Carolina, one not built on liberty, but on obedience, secrecy, and blood. 30 miles inland from Charleston, past the last honest farms and down a road that didn't appear on maps, lay a plantation with no master's name on its gate. Just a crude iron emblem forged into the wood, a single wing broken at the tip. The locals called it Seraphim's Grace. They never asked why. Gabriel Whitworth was 43 when he claimed the land. He paid cash, hard coin, not script. Nobody knew from where. Some say it came from a war chest hidden by loyalists. Others whispered it was gifted by a European cabal with a hunger for flesh. But those who lived in the Low Country knew one thing for sure. Gabriel didn't come to grow rice. He came to harvest something else. He stood over 6 feet tall, silver-haired before his time, with a voice that could make the air itself stand still. Men listened when he spoke, not because he demanded it, but because something inside them needed to. That was his gift. Gabriel wasn't alone. His wife, Constance, moved through the world like smoke. Present, but never quite touchable. She rarely spoke. Her eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much and decided never to see again. Their children, raised not in love but in doctrine, not in truth but in hierarchy. Ezekiel, the firstborn, had already tasted blood by the time he turned 12. They say he once strangled a dog just to see what the soul looked like as it left the eyes. Miriam, beautiful, soft-spoken, could cry on command. She'd read the Psalms while slipping laudanum into a visitor's tea. Her victims always smiled before they fell. Then there were the twins, Cain and Abel. One was brute force, the other subtle cruelty. And finally the youngest, Lilith, 16 years old, and already more obedient than the others combined. But Gabriel's most loyal disciple wasn't his wife or children. It was his younger brother, Raphael, or, as he insisted others call him, Seraph. A doctor once, but his medicine had no intention of healing, And as the trees grew thick and the ground turned soft beneath their boots, the Whitworths prepared their masterpiece, a chapel, but not for worship, for judgment. And the first brick was laid in silence. To outsiders, it was just another plantation chapel, whitewashed walls, tall arched windows, and a steeple that pierced the sky like a warning. But what lay beneath was something no sermon could absolve. Gabriel Whitworth designed it himself, not the architecture. That was left to a drunk Charleston mason bribed with whiskey and women. Gabriel designed the purpose, every square foot, every shadow, every stone laid with precision, not for beauty, but for containment. Behind the altar, a narrow door, invisible to the casual eye. It led to a stone stairwell winding downward into the earth, into silence, damp and eternal. And at the base, 5 rooms, no light, no airflow, no mercy. The walls were 3 feet thick, lined with moss-covered brick and clay meant to trap sound. You could scream until your throat tore. No one in the pews above would hear you. No one would come, because no one was supposed to. Each cell was fitted with iron shackles, chains bolted into the walls, and crude drainage holes in the corners, for fluids no one ever talked about. Seraph, the brother doctor, called them necessary hygienic precautions, but in truth they were part of a system, a machine of belief and blood. You see, the Whitworths didn't think of themselves as criminals. They weren't just torturing people, they were saving them. Or at least, that's what Gabriel preached. Salvation through suffering, redemption through exposure. The blade, he once said, removes the rot so the soul may breathe. They weren't catching slaves, they were catching souls. And they didn't need to hunt, they lured. It started small, whispers in the quarters of nearby plantations, stories passed between the broken and the desperate, a safe haven, a holy place where runaways could find shelter, food, and passage to the north. There were even passwords, words of hope wrapped in scripture. The Lamb walks west. The stars know your name. Code phrases, lies, all of them, but effective. People came, sometimes 1, sometimes 4 at a time, starving, bleeding, terrified, but full of hope. And when they saw Angel's Rest glowing by lantern light at the edge of the swamp, they believed. Miriam met them first, smiling, barefoot, her hands open like some kind of southern saint. She gave them food, clean water. She quoted scripture. She touched their faces like they were already saved, and they followed her inside. They always followed her inside. Fresh clothes, a clean cot, food that tasted like memory, cornbread, smoked pork, molasses, and for a few fleeting hours, the desperate believed they had outrun hell. That illusion was part of the design. Gabriel insisted on it. Redemption, he'd say, must always wear the face of peace before the storm. The Whitworths had perfected it into ritual. The first night was comfort. The second, conversation, not interrogation, not yet. Just talk. Miriam would sit beside the newcomers, candlelight dancing in her eyes, her voice low and soft as river water. She asked questions like a friend. Where are you from? Who helped you? To get this far? Are there others coming? Not for betrayal, she'd say, but to protect them, to keep everyone safe. And they'd answer, of course they would, because she made them feel seen. Cain and Abel watched from the shadows. One leaned against the doorway, arms folded, a smirk curling on his lips. The other sat quietly, writing down every word, every name, every route. They were cataloging the underground. Then came Ezekiel. He'd wait until the 3rd day. That was when hope began to settle, when people started to think they might actually be safe. He'd arrive in the early morning, dressed like a preacher. Clean coat, silver cross, boots polished so perfectly they reflected the flame. He'd enter the chapel, smile wide, and say, "Let's talk about your journey." But this wasn't small talk. This was sorting. He'd assess strength, intelligence, usefulness. Young men with strong backs were marked for extended sessions. He needed details about defenses, contacts, patterns. Older women were deemed expendable, killed quickly, their bodies preserved by Seraph for shipment north. Children were rare, but when they came, Miriam handled them personally. Her tenderness never wavered, not even when she gave them the tea that stopped their hearts in silence. The victims never saw the basement. Not at first. That came on the fourth night. They'd be taken in pairs. One awake, the other drugged. Less struggle that way. Seraph preferred them awake. Said fear made the blood rush sweeter, the organs warmer, easier to preserve, and when the door behind the altar opened and the stairwell yawned beneath them, some realized the truth too late. It wasn't a church, it was a funnel, and they had been poured into it. Because inside Angels' Rest, no one left the way they came. Some begged, others prayed, a few even tried to fight, but once you crossed the threshold behind the altar, it no longer mattered what kind of man you were before, because inside the basement of Angels' Rest, you weren't a person anymore, you were inventory. Seraph called it the catalog, a hand-bound volume, black leather, lined with parchment so brittle it crackled under touch. Each victim was given a number, not a name. Names were for the living, numbers were easier to process and to forget. Entry 001. Male, approx 29. Strong musculature, high potential intelligence. Disposition, resistant. Method, respiratory paralysis followed by exsanguination. Value, $85. Each page told a story, if you could stomach reading between the lines. Seraph was a scientist in the way spiders are architects, precise, patient, unmoved by suffering. He believed in balance, a soul for a soul, a scream for a secret. He didn't torture for pleasure, but he didn't avoid it either. He said it was the side effect of revelation. The tools he used weren't crude, no whips, no brands, just pressure, just silence, just 1,000 tiny incisions in all the right places. It was said Seraph could keep a man alive, aware, for 72 hours while harvesting parts of him, piece by piece. And yet, he prayed before each session. That's what disturbed Ezekiel the most, not the torture, but the theology. Before every act of destruction, Seraph would close his eyes, press blood-stained hands together, and whisper, "Cleanse me, O Lord, that I may cleanse them." He believed in it. They all did. Gabriel had shaped his family into a religious order of violence. The Order of Fallen Angels wasn't just a front. It was a doctrine, a twisted gospel where pain was purification and death was just the beginning of obedience. Outside they were saints, feeding the poor, tending the sick, offering sermons about deliverance. Inside they were reapers with God on their lips and prophet in their hands. Miriam often sang hymns during executions. She said it soothed the dying, but even death didn't always mean peace. The most valuable bodies were sent to Charleston under forged names. Medical schools I'd well for free black citizens who had died of fever. They never asked questions. Why would they? Their hands stayed clean. Because evil, when hidden well enough, wears a lab coat, or a crucifix, or a smile. By the spring of 1792, the machine was running too smoothly to be called anything less than industrial. Victims came weekly, sometimes driven by whispers planted by the Whitworths themselves, other times by the sheer desperation born of a system that ground human souls into dust. But now the family had a problem. Success. The basement was nearly always full. Gabriel expanded operations. He ordered the construction of a second building just behind the chapel, disguised as a shed for religious supplies. In truth, it was Seraph's new lab, a cleaner, colder place where bodies could be drained, preserved, and packed for shipment without drawing flies or suspicion. Ezekiel streamlined intake. New arrivals were now processed like livestock, weighed, measured, catalogued, and sorted by usefulness. Those with skills, blacksmiths, herbalists, runaways with knowledge of northern safe houses, were kept longer. Their pain had value. The rest? Expedited. But something darker was stirring beneath the order and efficiency. Gabriel had begun to change. His sermons, once elegant and measured, had grown manic, laced with visions, proclamations, and cryptic declarations that unsettled even his own family. He spoke of cleansing the marrow of America, of preparing a new Jerusalem where only the purified could rule. His eyes, already pale, now seemed to flicker with something fevered. Constance, ever silent, began to tremble when he spoke. She took to sleeping in the children's quarters. The staff noticed, but no one questioned Gabriel. Not out loud. Miriam kept smiling. but her hands began to shake. The twins, Cain and Abel, had taken to carving strange symbols into the wooden beams above each cell, runic marks no one had seen before. They claimed they kept the souls inside. Only Seraph remained calm. In Fae. But he was thriving. He had begun experimenting with chemical agents to prolong suffering without impairing the body's sellable condition. He called it the suspension, a concoction of laudanum, belladonna, and crushed hornet resin that kept the heart racing and the brain intact, even as the body begged for release. One man lasted 10 days, and then came the storm. A true one. Sheets of rain, water rising through the fields, roads washed away. A body floated to the surface near the chapel path, not one of theirs, a child from a nearby farm. Her hands bound, her mouth filled with ash. Locals began to murmur. Sheriff McClellan rode out 3 days later to investigate. He never returned. And after that, fear did something Gabriel could never have planned. It made him a legend. And Gabriel Whitworth, whether he intended to or not, became something more than a man. He became a myth, a shadow that loomed just beyond firelight, just behind polite conversation, the kind of figure you didn't name after dark for fear he might hear it. The story of Sheriff McClellan's disappearance spread faster than the river could rise. His horse returned riderless, saddle bloodied, badge missing. Some said he drowned in the marsh. Others claimed they saw him days later, wandering barefoot, eyes white, muttering the Lord's Prayer in reverse. No search party was ever formed, because no one wanted to knock on the Whitworth door. The family, of course, issued concern. Gabriel personally sent a letter of condolence to McClellan's widow, along with a basket of sweet preserves and a Bible inscribed in gold. He even offered a reward for information. It was theater, and the county played its part. Fear does not just silence tongues, it rewrites entire communities. The preacher stops asking questions, the midwife looks the other way, the judge avoids signing certain warrants, and the townsfolk learn to forget what they saw. But inside the Whitworth estate something was unraveling. Gabriel's behavior was becoming erratic. He took to walking the fields barefoot at night, whispering to things that weren't there. He stopped eating, began fasting for days, claiming divine revelation. He spoke of visions, wings on fire, rivers of screaming mouths, angels with empty eyes. Constance grew gaunt and ghostly. She no longer attended services. Her only act of defiance was subtle. She stopped dressing in white, now always in black. Miriam found her one morning in the drawing room, silently sewing a doll. Not a child's doll, an effigy. Human hair, teeth sewn into the hem. No one spoke of it. Ezekiel took over more of the family business, stepping into his father's role with a coldness that made even Cain nervous. He stopped smiling altogether, just observed, calculated, spoke only when absolutely necessary, and never about dreams. And Seraph began cataloging his brother's descent. He kept a second ledger now, hidden, bound in red, not of victims but of Gabriel's ravings. He transcribed the sermons, the sleepwalking, the muttering scratched into the chapel walls in charcoal. He believed something was happening, not madness, transformation. And deep down, even he began to wonder, was Gabriel still leading the order? Or had something else taken hold? Summer 1793. The air in the marsh thickened, not just with heat, but with a kind of tension, a pressure you could feel in your teeth, the kind that makes animals silent and children cry without knowing why. Angel's Rest, once the tool of horror, had begun to feel haunted, not by the dead, but by something older. Gabriel stopped preaching. He no longer appeared in town, no more Sunday services, no more charity drives, no more tea with church elders. People noticed, but nobody asked. The Whitworths had already passed the point of public accountability. When monsters grow large enough, the world simply adapts around them. Inside Seraphim's grace, however, the order did not pause. If anything, the rituals grew darker. Cain and Abel began carving notches into victims' ribs before death, marking them with what they called seals of silence. Seraph at first protested, claiming it damaged the integrity of the cadavers, but Gabriel approved. "A soul unbranded," he said one night during dinner, "is a soul unclaimed." He hadn't spoken aloud in days. Then suddenly, that sentence, calm, clear, eyes rolled back like marbled glass. No one spoke after, they just kept eating. Miriam had taken over as the new voice of salvation. She led services now. Her sermons were gentle, almost maternal. She quoted scripture and spoke of the narrow path to redemption. But between the psalms, she whispered names, the real names of the dead, to no one in particular, out loud, as if calling them back. Sharif noted everything, the change in tone, the collective shift in behavior. Even young Lilith, once obedient, mechanical, began sketching symbols into her books, symbols that matched carvings on the chapel's foundation stones. Ones no one had taught her. It was Miriam who finally asked the question no one else dared. At the end of a family meal, while the others scraped plates or chewed slowly in silence, she looked across the table at Gabriel and said, "Father, are we still the ones in control?" He didn't answer, just raised his hand and touched the side of his head, then his chest, then the center of the table. 3 points, over and over, like a ritual. That night, the air in the house shifted. Candles wouldn't stay lit. The servants heard whispers in the hall. Animals began refusing to enter the chapel. And in the fields, the rice turned black, still growing. But black, no blight, just darkness, growing from the root. By autumn, the Whitworth estate was no longer part of South Carolina, not in spirit. It existed in a kind of pocket outside the ordinary flow of time, outside morality, outside even weather. Rye then passed around the plantation. The fog stayed low and constant, and the air, heavy, like it carried secrets it didn't want to let go. Those who worked the fields, the enslaved, became silent. Shadows. They moved as if watched, not just by overseers but by something else. They stopped singing, no hymns, no folk songs, just the sound of water and footsteps and breath. Gabriel had vanished completely into the chapel. He no longer spoke, not to his family, not to God. He spent hours beneath the altar, in the hidden crypts, sitting cross-legged before the bones of the first victims. No light, no food, just silence. And when he did emerge, he was changed. Sharif, the only one who dared write it down, recorded his findings. Pulse erratic, eyes dilated in full sunlight, flesh unusually cold to the touch, refuses food, no apparent loss of energy, wakes with markings on his arms he claims he did not make. The symbol recurs, 3 interlocking wings with the center torn. It does not appear in any text I know. Even Ezekiel began to doubt. He told Miriam in private that he believed their father had become a vessel. Not possessed, he whispered, but replaced. He believed something had stepped through Gabriel's faith, a force beyond comprehension, and now wore his skin like a borrowed suit. But Miriam disagreed. She said Gabriel had finally become what he was always meant to be. Then one night, the chanting began. Not from the family, but from underneath the chapel. The cells hadn't been used in days. No new arrivals, no current victims, but still. The sound rose, low, rhythmic, not quite language, not quite human. It echoed through the stone, rattling floorboards, fogging mirrors, making the servants bleed from the nose without pain. Sharif tried to investigate. He descended into the basement with a lantern and a loaded pistol. What he found, he never recorded. When he returned, he burned all his medical notes, every record, every drawing, every formula, gone. That night he stood in the family graveyard, holding a match to his life's work, whispering, "It isn't debt, which we should fear. It's what teaches us to survive." And then he looked toward the chapel, and he wept, not out of sorrow, but recognition. There's a moment in every descent when turning back becomes impossible. Not because the path has vanished, but because something inside you has changed. Something has been opened that cannot be shut. By the winter solstice of 1793, the Whitworth estate had reached that threshold. No more victims arrived, not because there were no more runaways, but because the order had stopped spreading the whispers. They didn't need to. Now people came on their own, but not the desperate, not the enslaved, the curious. Men from Charleston, Savannah, even as far north as Baltimore. Preachers, doctors, merchants, minor aristocrats. They came unannounced by moonlight, bearing gifts, blood-stained scrolls, teeth wrapped in velvet, bones inscribed with Latin prayers, and they all asked the same question, "Is he ready?" They never said who he was, but the family knew. Gabriel had become more than a leader. He had become a locus, a living altar. He no longer ate, no longer slept. He hovered in a state Serif could only describe as sustained unbeing. His flesh remained intact, but something else flickered behind the eyes, something not bound by human frailty. He began drawing symbols on the chapel walls, not with ink, but with his fingernails. Deep gouges, always the same shape, 3 wings intertwined, bleeding from the center. The same emblem that had appeared in Lilith's sketches months earlier, the same that now appeared in the twisted grain of the chapel pews, in the veins of leaves pressed between Bible pages, even in the birthmarks of newborn animals born near the estate. Ezekiel, once the executor, now spent most of his time in the tower, alone. He no longer read, he just listened, as if trying to decode a frequency only he could hear. Sometimes, as he'd laugh for hours, sometimes he'd scream into the mirror until his throat bled. Miriam had become still. She no longer moved unless spoken to. She stood at the front of the chapel, every night for hours, facing the altar, whispering to it. Abel stopped speaking entirely. Cain took to walking the grounds with a shovel, digging holes, then filling them again. And Serif, he was preparing something, a ritual, one he never spoke of, one that required candles made of human tallow, pages sewn from cured skin, and a silver crucible buried during a blood moon. The final page of his red ledger was blank, except for one line, written with shaking hand. When the veil tears, the faithful will not be spared, only the prepared. The first horse was found in the chapel, slaughtered, arranged, not dumped, placed. Its legs splayed in the shape of a compass rose, eyes removed, but the body otherwise untouched. No blood, not a drop. Just that bloated, sunken corpse laid across the altar as if offered. No one claimed responsibility. Gabriel, now nearly translucent from starvation, stared at the carcass for hours. Never blinked, never moved. Just stood barefoot in the cold, lips twitching with some silent recitation only he could hear. By the next morning, 3 more animals had died, each one closer to the house, and then the dreams began. Not nightmares, messages. Serif was the first to write his down, jagged lines, a language of symbols that didn't exist in any lexicon. He called it the tongue beneath the tongue, a kind of anti-language, meaning through absence, every word a wound. Lilith followed. Her drawings became violent, unhinged, twisting corridors, rooms that bled, faces inverted and strung together like rosary beads. When Constance tried to take the pages away, Lilith bit her. She didn't even scream, just stared with that same distant gaze Gabriel had worn for months. Miriam was next. She stopped sleeping entirely. Instead, she painted, not with brushes but with her fingers, using mud, ash, and blood. By dawn, every wall in the east wing of the manor was covered in sigils. Some appeared to move when the candles flickered, some stayed cold, even when touched. Cain claimed he saw one blink. And Ezekiel had locked himself in the tower with nothing but a bucket of water and a Bible with every verse about angels torn out. He had scratched a single phrase into the stone wall. The 7th veil is rotting. No one knew what it meant, except Gabriel. He finally spoke. After weeks of silence, he emerged from the chapel barefoot, eyes bleeding, hands wrapped in bandages soaked through with something darker than blood. He walked to the center of the estate, knelt in the mud, and whispered just loud enough for Serif to hear, "It's begun." Then the earth trembled, not an earthquake, but something subtler, a pulse through the bones of the land. Animals began fleeing the property, birds stopped nesting in the trees, insects vanished, the ground soured, the rice withered, and the chapel doors stayed open. For the first time in 4 years, they didn't need to be closed, because what had been summoned was already inside. The sky changed first, not visibly, not to the average man, but to those who'd spent years staring at the horizon. Something was wrong. The stars shifted, constellations bent slightly out of place, like a painting left in the sun too long. Orion's belt unfastened itself, the North Star dimmed, and over the Whitworth estate, no stars appeared at all, just blackness, thick, unmoving, absolute. Gabriel began sleeping beneath the chapel. He called it the womb. He no longer spoke to his family, only to the stone. At night, Miriam brought him water laced with salt and blood. Lilith sat outside the chapel doors, humming one unbroken note for hours. The tune never wavered, never faltered. It wasn't a song. It was a frequency. Seraph had stopped documenting. His journals remained open, untouched, their ink dry. Instead, he prayed, but not to God. He knelt before the fireplace in his study, arms raised, whispering names he'd never learned, reciting rituals he had no memory of reading. Once Cain caught him speaking with his own reflection, and the reflection spoke back. Abel tried to burn the chapel. He waited until nightfall, soaked the floorboards in whale oil, and set a torch to the altar. The flame died in his hand, not went out, died. The wick blackened instantly. The heat vanished. The smoke curled backward into his mouth, choking him to the floor. He didn't try again. Instead, he began carving a massive spiral into the dirt behind the manor house, 10 feet wide, 6 feet deep. He said it would catch what's coming. No one questioned it, because by now the family understood. They weren't summoning anything. They were preparing for its arrival. It wasn't possession. It was incubation. The order had never been about power or control or even profit. It was about making room, making the flesh into a vessel, making the blood into a gate, making the chapel into a mouth. And that mouth was beginning to open. Just past midnight on the coldest night of the year, Ezekiel rang the bell. 3 times. The chapel bell hadn't sounded since Gabriel's final sermon, but now it echoed, deep, low, mournful, calling not to the town, but to whatever waited beyond the veil. And the earth answered, not with thunder, but with laughter. The laughter came from beneath, not human, not animal, a sound like air being dragged across broken teeth, low, warbling, unnatural. It didn't echo. It infected. People in nearby settlements reported hearing it in their dreams. Some awoke with blood on their pillows. One man wandered into town barefoot, tongue severed, eyes rolled white, murmuring, "It's awake. It's under us." And then the soil began to bleed, not metaphorically, literally. Crimson seeped from the rice fields in slow pulses, rising between stalks like dew. The Whitworths didn't harvest. They watched. God. Brielle stood at the edge of the marsh with his arms raised, as if receiving communion from the skyless heavens. Miriam wrote a new liturgy, pages and pages of verses spoken in reverse Latin, broken Old English, and symbols drawn in circular loops. She said it wasn't a religion anymore. It was a translation, a way to make sense of what speaks in rot and gravity. Seraph had gone completely silent. He no longer looked anyone in the eye. He paced the manor in loops, tracing the same path over and over. East wing, dining hall, chapel, cellar, graveyard, then start again. He carried a bell with no clapper, just held it like a totem. Sometimes it rattled anyway. Cain began losing teeth, not from injury, just falling out. No pain, no rot, just empty sockets and bloodless gums. He kept the teeth in a jar by the window, mumbling about the exchange rate. When asked what that meant, he simply smiled with his ruined mouth. Abel's spiral grew larger, 20 feet now. In the center, he placed a mirror wrapped in lambskin. Every morning, he knelt before it, waiting, watching. Some days he would scream at it, other days weep. But the mirror never showed his face, only static, like water boiling beneath frost. And Constance? She stopped speaking altogether. Her hair turned white overnight. Her fingers never stopped moving. Knitting, sewing, weaving strings of black thread into shapes no one recognized. She hung them from the ceiling, from trees, from her own sleeves, amulets, perhaps, or warnings. Then came the sermonless Sabbath. The family gathered in the chapel, no candles, no scripture, just silence. Gabriel rose from the stone pit at the altar's base, filthy, blind, and smiling. He spoke one word. A name, not a human name, not one you say aloud. And the floor of the chapel cracked, the wood groaned, the walls pulsed, and something moved beneath, not climbed, not walked, uncoiled. The bind. They called it the arrival, but not with celebration. There was no rejoicing, only the stillness of prey. After the floor split beneath the altar, the family sealed the chapel, not with locks, but with blood. Serif sliced his palm across the threshold, whispering syllables so ancient they turned to steam the moment they left his mouth. He did not seal it to keep people out. He sealed it to keep what had risen, contained, for now. But the seal was a threadbare rope over a rising tide. The entity, if it could still be called that, had form without shape, not seen, but known. It didn't need eyes. It didn't need limbs. It reached into you the way fever does, through cracks in logic and breath and prayer. Gabriel stood at its center, not as a prophet, not as a master, as a host. His body no longer needed food, no longer excreted waste. Serif wrote in the red ledger, "All bodily functions have ceased, yet he speaks, he walks, he dreams for us all. The boundaries between spirit and sinew have unraveled." By January, 3 of the estate's enslaved laborers had gone missing, not escaped, taken, pulled straight into the chapel during evening prayers, their screams muffled by a sudden stillness in the air. The sound died, the wind died, even the flames paused. No one tried to intervene, not because they didn't care, because they understood. The entity fed not on flesh, but on submission. The more one surrendered, the deeper it reached. And then the bones began to hum. Every family member heard it, deep in their skulls, like the marrow itself had become a tuning fork. It came at midnight, always midnight, a frequency that wasn't sound, but pressure, like your own blood had a secret to tell and it was shouting through your veins. Lilith was the first to bleed from her ears. She didn't scream, she laughed. Eyes rolled back, fingers twitching, she whispered, "I can hear the garden again." When Constance asked what that meant, Lilith handed her a folded scrap of skin with symbols carved in it, her own, and then she walked into the spiral Abel had due, and vanished. No flash, no scream, just gone, not devoured, claimed, and somewhere beneath the soil, the entity stirred, because now it had a voice. By spring, no one called it a plantation anymore. The fields lay fallow, the rice dead, the buildings rotting, not from time but from within. Wood curled back on itself, paint blistered, nails rusted black despite no rain. Even stone began to sweat, exuding a sour, metallic scent like breath held too long underground. Locals started to vanish, not just the curious or the lost, but families, entire households on the outskirts of the parish gone without a trace. Food still warm, horses still tethered, doors wide open like mouths frozen mid-scream. The constables stopped coming, and in Charleston a rumor began. The Whitworths served something older than God. Inside Seraphim's grace, the entity no longer hid. It did not appear, but its will was present in every corner. You could feel it in the temperature shifts, the vibrating air, the way shadows moved where light didn't reach. Gabriel no longer had a name. He answered only to He who was hollowed. And now, he glowed, faintly, just beneath the skin, as though his blood had turned to embers and his body was just a lantern. Serif had stopped sleeping. His journals became drawings, frantic, labyrinthine maps of rooms that didn't exist, corridors that bent in on themselves, staircases made of vertebrae. He began using his own blood as ink. His last coherent note read, "It's building a cathedral inside us, bone by bone." Miriam stopped speaking altogether. She began levitating during the early hours of morning, not floating, ascending, as if pulled by strings from beneath the earth rather than above. And Ezekiel? He gouged out his own eyes, used a dinner fork. They found him standing in front of the chapel, grinning, blood down his cheeks, whispering, "I see it now, Fact symmetry. We were just the scaffolding." Cain and Abel began disintegrating in opposite ways. Cain's body collapsed, skin peeling, teeth falling, muscles separating from bone. Abel's mind collapsed, Language failed him, thought reduced to growls and scratching symbols into mud with broken fingers, but the entity was pleased, because sacrifice wasn't a loss, it was currency. Each body that fell made more room, each mind that shattered opened another door, each broken oath, each betrayal, each forgotten scream built another step downward, toward whatever waited at the root. And as the chapel's floor pulsed and buckled and breathed, Gabriel smiled. Because the final phase had begun. The house was no longer a home. It was a womb, and something terrible was ready to be born. It began with the bells, but not the chapel bell. These were older, hung deep in the earth, forged in silence, rung by absence. No clappers, no rope, just resonance. A sound that echoed not through the air but through memory itself. Those near the estate swore they had heard it before. In dreams long forgotten, or maybe in the womb. The soil rejected tools, spades bent, shovels snapped. Even the strongest plow would seize and splinter when brought near the spiral. Abel's pit, now 40 feet wide, had become a vortex of insects, dead birds, and bones the family couldn't identify. Lilith's voice began returning, but it wasn't hers anymore. When she spoke, it was in tones that shifted mid-syllable, childlike, then ancient. Male, then inhuman. She would walk barefoot through the halls, dragging a rusted chain behind her, murmuring, "He's hungry for geometry." When Constance asked what that meant, Lilith looked her in the eye and whispered, "Your spine. It has 13 gates." The following night, Constance attempted to drown herself in the baptismal basin. The water refused her. It boiled, burned her hands, but didn't scald the porcelain. The steam rose in spirals, shapes flickered in it, faces made of flame, wings stitched from bone. Serif tried to stop her, but he was already unraveling. He hadn't eaten in days, yet he didn't weaken. His body sustained itself through sheer proximity to the entity. His skin grew translucent. You could see veins that weren't his, pulsing in rhythms that defied anatomy. He said, "It's rewriting us. We are no longer human. We're vessels for precision." The entity had no name, not one you could speak. Its true name was a shape, not a triangle, not a circle. A construct that bends perception, forces the brain to see through itself. A sigil that infects the eye and erodes the soul. Those who glimpsed it, even briefly, developed migraines, seizures, or devotion. Gabriel branded it into his own chest with heated iron. Miriam did the same with her fingernails. They bled for hours, then stopped bleeding altogether, because their hearts no longer beat in rhythm with this world. Instead, they beat in perfect time with the depth below. And it was almost time. The spiral began to hum, not loudly, just enough to vibrate your molars when you stood near it. A warning, a lullaby, or a countdown. The spiral opened on a night without stars. No moon, no clouds, just a sky that looked hollow. Abel stood beside the pit, knees cracked, eyes ruined from weeks of staring into the mirror buried at its center. He smiled, weeping silently, as the first draft of wind rose from below. Not air, breath, as if something vast and unsleeping had just exhaled. The soil buckled, cracked. And then, the light. Not fire, not sunlight, not anything holy. It came in pulses, blue-black, iridescent like oil, and it didn't illuminate. It revealed. Suddenly you could see the veins inside the trees, the moisture trapped beneath centuries of bark, the way the stones trembled beneath the pressure of what approached. And then came the voices, all speaking at once, none speaking words. The sound bypassed the ears. It landed in the bones. You didn't hear it, you remembered it. Low, like a childhood lullaby that was never sung but etched into your marrow before birth. Serif fell to his knees, hands over his ears, screaming, "It's not speaking to us, it's remembering through us." Gabriel emerged from the chapel barefoot, naked, glowing like a lantern held in a cave too long. His flesh pulsed with breath. He stepped toward the spiral and whispered, "We are the tongue, we are the offering, we are the map drawn in blood." Lilith danced along the edge of the pit, her laughter echoing backwards, each sound fading before it left her mouth. She began throwing items into the vortex. Old Bibles, locks of hair, teeth and cloth, pages from Miriam's liturgy. One by one, the items were swallowed, not burned, not devoured, unwritten. They ceased to have existed at all, as if time bent around the pit and edited reality to make room for what was coming. Miriam stood still as a statue. She had carved the sigil onto her own abdomen, layer by layer. It glowed now, a wound of light. She whispered, "He needs a shape. He needs a mother." And then, Abel stepped forward. He didn't fall. He offered. He placed the mirror, cracked, pulsing, humming, into the center of the spiral. It shimmered once, then dissolved like sugar in water. And with it, so did he. His body stretched, blurred, inverted itself, and was gone. No scream, no death, just absorption. The spiral stopped humming, and the earth fell silent, because it had received its first true disciple. The silence didn't feel empty, it felt full, like the air had been replaced with breath held too long, like every molecule was waiting, listening, remembering what it once served. And in that stillness, Gabriel knelt at the spiral's edge. His mouth opened, not in prayer, but in invitation. What came out wasn't language, it was origin. A sound older than bone, older than light. The raw syllables of creation, spoken in reverse. A language never meant to be heard aloud, a language that unwrites. The trees bowed, the manor cracked, the chapel doors burst open. Inward, as if something on the inside had tried to flee, but there was nowhere left to run. Because now the spiral was a gate, and the entity had chosen its name, not a word, a number. 7. Not for perfection, not for holiness, but for the 7 veils that separate this world from the one beneath it. And now, the 7th veil was rotting. Lilith began to sing. Soft, strange notes that spiraled in on themselves, each verse older than the last. The melody cracked glass. Animals seized in the woods. Insects crawled from the ground and burst into ash beneath her feet. She walked the spiral's edge counterclockwise, arms outstretched, eyes rolled white. Miriam followed her, but not as a sister, as a guide. She was no longer a Whitworth. She was the midwife, and what stirred beneath the soil was crowning. Seraph, trembling, tried to speak. His lips moved, but no sound emerged. Only dust. He raised his hand to stop Lilith, but it crumbled before it reached her. Not in pain, just undone, like his body had run out of permission to exist. Gabriel placed both hands into the spiral, palms flat against the breathing soil. He exhaled one final time and whispered, "Make me your mouth." And the earth obliged. His arms snapped backward, his jaw unhinged. His spine cracked in 14 places, but still he knelt, eyes shining with submission. From the pit rose something that was not flesh, not form, but intention. A shape trying to be seen, a geometry so perfect it collapsed reason around it. Light bent, shadows fled, every eye within a mile radius went blind, and every soul was opened. The land pulsed, the spiral flared, and then everything stopped. One heartbeat. Then it was born. But not in screams, in recognition, and every remaining Whitworth knelt, heads bowed, and whispered in perfect unison, "He is geometry. We are the error." From that moment on, the world was no longer linear. I'm afraid. Events doubled back on themselves. People vanished from photographs. Tombstones bore dates that hadn't yet come. Clocks spun until the hands snapped off, and the spiral, it no longer led downward, it led inward, to a place outside of God. The surrounding land, once mapped, once owned, began to unmap itself. Roads twisted, trees grew in impossible directions, compasses pointed not north, but toward the chapel. Toward the womb. The entity, 7, had not arrived with flame or fury. It arrived with precision, and precision is colder than death. Constance was the first to be taken. She walked into the rice fields at dawn, her arms open, whispering fragments of lullabies. When they found her, she was still standing, frozen, completely calcified. Skin turned to marble, eyes open, wide with awe. On her chest, the seventh sigil, carved down to the bone, pulsing with faint blue light. Miriam knelt before her, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "The vessel is sealed. The harvest begins." That day, 7 new spirals opened, smaller but identical in shape and pulse, each at a cardinal point around the estate. The geometry was intentional, perfect, ritualized. The family didn't walk between them. They moved through them. Distance no longer mattered. Miriam could disappear into one and emerge from another. Time collapsed. Travel became conceptual, and Lilith, no longer a girl, was now called the Eye. She wandered the woods blindfolded, yet never stumbled. She could name every insect within a mile. She could taste truth in the air. When birds flew overhead, they spiraled mid-flight and fell dead, their wings twisted into mirrored sigils. The Whitworths weren't worshipping anymore. They were compiling. Gabriel kept a ledger not of names, but of thoughts. He would sit for hours, eyes rolled back, muttering what he called the remembered index, thoughts that didn't come from him, visions of other places, other worlds, a black ocean that breathed, a cathedral made of meat, a city that walked on legs of bone. He wrote these memories with both hands at once, not mirrored, twin streams of language, one forward, one backward, and in the chapel, Serif translated them into equations, not spiritual truths, blueprints, because 7 didn't want followers. It wanted reconstruction, the human form, the mind, the soul. They were merely drafts. Now, it would build something better. And the spiral? That was just the first cut. The first reconstruction began in the grain cellar, a simple stone-walled structure at the edge of the property built to hold wheat and dried rice, but now it held bones, hundreds, maybe thousands, human and not, arranged with exacting symmetry, not stacked, woven. Abel's ledger had become scripture. Though he no longer existed in form, his writing continued. Pages appeared each dawn, laid gently on the altar, written in blood that did not match anyone still living. The writings described the dimensions of the new shape, what 7 called the human obelisk, a being of intention beyond flesh, built from memory, sound, and symmetry. The Whitworths weren't preparing a resurrection. They were preparing a reformat. Serif was now a shadow. His body was there, but hollowed out, stretched thin like parchment over a moving frame. His voice no longer emerged from his mouth. It came from nearby objects, walls, water, even flame. He said, 7 speaks sideways. You must learn to listen wrong. The chapel changed. Its wood peeled like bark. Inside, the pews shifted their angles slightly each night, as if aligning to a geometry unseen. The cross above the altar melted, not like wax, but like metal rejecting its own shape. Gabriel had stopped eating entirely. He stood motionless at the front of the chapel for 7 days. On the 8th, he began weeping a fluid that looked like ink. It stained everything it touched, and where it soaked into floorboards, faint symbols began to bloom, moving, breathing, resisting comprehension. And then came the census. Miriam took it upon herself to travel to the surrounding counties, but not to ask questions. Not anymore. She simply stood outside homes and waited. When people answered the door, she smiled, held up a small mirror, and whispered, "You are not counted, but you will be remembered." Those who looked into the mirror were never the same. Some screamed and clawed their eyes out. Others collapsed and whispered numbers, always 7 digits long. One man walked into the sea and never resurfaced. They had all seen the draft of the new world. The next morning, those same houses were gone, not burned, not destroyed, erased. Grass grew where walls once stood, no debris, no foundation, no memory, except for a faint spiral of stones in the soil and a single black feather nailed to a tree nearby. That feather became the new sigil of passage. The old world was being indexed, marked, prepared, because 7 didn't invade, it catalogued, and once the catalog was complete, reconstruction would begin. The reconstruction began not with violence, but with mirrors. They appeared one morning throughout the estate, on trees, in windows above fireplaces, even hanging from the necks of the cattle. Every mirror showed the same reflection, not the viewer's face, But the chapel, always the chapel, even when you turned your back to it, even when you destroyed the mirror. It came back the next day, larger. Miriam said they weren't reflections at all. They were invitations, each one a door waiting to open inward. Lilith began speaking to them, not aloud, with gestures, with eye contact, with breath. She called them the eyes of the veil, and in the cellar the obelisk began to take shape, not a sculpture, a being. 12 feet tall, constructed from bone, memory, and sound. Its spine was made from the vertebrae of 7 generations of Whitworths. Its skull, a fusion of 3 unknown species, and its ribs still moved, not from wind, not from breath, from intention. Gabriel stopped walking entirely. He now hovered 3 inches above the floor, eyes always open, mouth always smiling. His voice came at midnight each night, monotone, slow, and filled with coordinates. Numbers, descriptions, names never spoken before in this world. Lilith recorded every word, then swallowed the pages. She said, "He doesn't speak to us. He speaks through us. We are the furniture of his voice." And by then, the soil had turned black, not burned, hollowed. It absorbed everything, rain, footprints, even sound. When you stepped into it, your breath became distant. Conversations whispered 5 feet away sounded like they came from another life. Then one night, 7 spoke back, through fire. The candles in the chapel ignited without flame, just light, and the stench of iron. Every member of the family fell to their knees. The walls bled, the windows cracked inward, and the spiral began to rise. Up from the pit it lifted, a helix of stone and blood, turning slowly, defying gravity. Inside it, the fetus, not human, not beast, something between. The child of 7, not born of womb or lust, but of calculation. Its skin was language, its eyes were mirrors, its breath rewrote the air itself, and Miriam, weeping, whispered, "He's perfect. Every cell is shaped like a spiral. He remembers the first forgetting." Outside the estate, a boy in Charleston screamed in his sleep. He had never heard of the Whitworths, but in his dream, he was Gabriel, and something inside him whispered, "Soon." By midsummer, the obelisk moved on its own, not in steps, in gestures, its limbs bending like thoughts rather than joints. Its form was elastic, yet deliberate. When it stood, walls shifted to make room. When it breathed, candles flickered in reverse. And when it spoke, it didn't use sound, it used memory. Every Whitworth fell to their knees when it addressed them, not out of reverence but because their bodies could not remain upright under the weight of recognition. They wept, not tears but fragments of forgotten dreams. Lilith began levitating during sleep. She would drift through the house like smoke, murmuring in tongues no longer rooted in the throat. She recited birth dates of people who hadn't been born yet. She painted symbols on the ceiling using water that boiled under her touch. Seraph called her the archive because her mind no longer stored ideas. It stored instruction. And those instructions, they came from beneath the spiral. The land now refused mapping. Every cartographer who approached disappeared. Roads once leading to the estate now curled back on themselves. One traveler claimed he walked toward the manor for 5 days and always ended up at his own front door, only older, always older. Time, it seemed, was being bled. Miriam's mirror became the primary relic. It no longer showed faces, it showed intended selves. Those who looked into it saw what 7 wanted them to become. Some dropped to the ground, shaking, others clawed their eyes out in defiance. A few smiled and walked into the cellar, never to return, not screaming, not struggling, just accepting. They became what Gabriel called the chorus, faceless, silent figures who stood around the obelisk, motionless. Each day one would vanish, and each time they did, the child below grew, not in size, in presence. It filled the chapel like smoke fills lungs. People began hearing whispers in towns miles away, not rumors, instructions. They would wake with soil beneath their fingernails, ash on their tongues. One woman in Savannah birthed a stillborn child with spiral scars carved into its back. She swore she had never been pregnant. The phenomenon was labeled a cultural hysteria, but it wasn't hysteria. It was a summons. 7 was reaching, not just through land or blood or prayer, but through architecture. The spiral had become a blueprint, and mankind was simply the scaffolding. By late August, words themselves began to fracture. Locals near the Whitworth estate reported a strange phenomenon. They would speak a sentence perfectly normal, and halfway through it would shift. Unintentionally, unconsciously, as if something inside them had changed the destination of the thought before it escaped. Pass the bread became, pass the veil. Where is my son? Became, where is my spiral? Even prayers twisted in their mouths. Church congregations abandoned the Lord's Prayer after hearing it reversed mid-sermon. Bibles in nearby homes grew blank in sections. Entire chapters faded to white, replaced with faint, looping symbols that bled when traced. Gabriel declared, 7 is claiming language. We spoke to name things. Now he speaks to unname them. And it was working. Serif lost all ability to write with ink. His hands moved perfectly, but every mark evaporated seconds after landing. So he turned to carving, into skin, into teeth, into bone. He whispered, it holds better there. The alphabet obeys bone. Lilith no longer slept. Instead, she sat in the corner of the chapel with her head tilted sideways, always listening. She'd answer questions before they were asked. One night, she began laughing softly and said, the air is starting to remember us. It's folding into our shapes. And Miriam, she began collecting reflections. Not mirrors anymore. People. She called them reflectors. Dozens of men and women who had once gazed into her mirror and survived. Now they followed her, eyes blank, movements synced. They stood in circles, in fields, in churches, facing nothing. But in unison they'd chant, the 7th gate bleeds, we are the welcome. On the 33rd night, the obelisk shed its skin, literally. The bone husk cracked and peeled, revealing something fluid inside. Not flesh, not muscle. Something that shimmered with data, with memory, with intent. It pulsed with every breath taken near it. It was aware. Gabriel approached it naked, face streaked with ink, and placed his hands on its core. He whispered, we have built your grammar. Now teach us to speak your wrath. The obelisk replied, not in voice, in weather, eh? Storm erupted without sky. Rain fell sideways. Wind spun in inverted spirals, thunder echoed before it struck, and for those caught in it, time split. Some lived entire years in a second. Others vanished completely, erased from all family memory. Photographs changed, diaries updated, graves filled themselves. Because 7 had reached its next phase, not invasion, occupation. The spiral was now alive, and it was teaching the soil to dream. By September's end, the soil began to speak, not with mouths, with repetition. Footprints made the same shape no matter where you stepped. Fallen leaves arranged themselves in spirals overnight. The crows flew in perfect loops over the estate, never breaking formation, never landing. It wasn't random. It was a script. The land itself had become text. And the Whitworths? They were no longer a family. They were a typeface. Each one a letter, a glyph, a living symbol within a sentence still being written. Gabriel's eyes had gone completely black, not from blindness, but because light refused to reflect off them anymore. He didn't eat, he didn't drink. He simply stood at the head of the chapel, chanting backward verses from a book that did not exist. When questioned, he only whispered, he's writing his name into time, 1 syllable per century. Lilith, still called the Eye, began seeing across bloodlines. She'd walk through town, lock eyes with a stranger, and name their grandfather's secrets aloud. Then she'd hand them a page, from a book they had never written but always dreamed of. The pages smelled of wet earth, of memory. Miriam's reflectors multiplied. Whole congregations went silent and followed her into the woods. Some were never seen again. Others returned with dirt in their mouths and spiral scars down their backs, speaking only in questions, but the questions didn't make sense. What color is subtraction? When does a scream learn to echo? If the moon forgets its orbit, do we bleed or blink? Serif had begun building the casket, not a place for death, but for completion. It was carved from the bones of those who had willingly entered the spiral and vanished. Its interior was lined with pages of skin, stitched together with memory string, a substance Seraph claimed he could only harvest during storms. When complete, the casket would contain the final seed of reverse Genesis, a recreation of man, not in God's image, but in Seven's. One morning the spiral opened by itself. No ritual, no chant, no Whitworth nearby, just earth breathing. And something stepped out. It was human, but wrong. No reflection, no shadow. Its eyes were windows into a different sky. It held nothing, but wherever it stood, sound died. Lilith approached it slowly, knelt and said, "You were the first word, and now you are the mouth." The being didn't speak, but every stone nearby cracked in unison. That day, the chapel's foundation vanished. The building floated 4 inches above the ground, tethered only by root systems that pulsed like veins, because the structure was no longer a house of worship. It was a throat, and soon it would begin to sing. They say the first time the chapel sang, birds fell from the sky, not dead, erased, mid-flight, mid-breath, mid-heartbeat. They simply unexisted. No bodies, no feathers, just sudden absence. The sound itself couldn't be recorded. Every device that tried, melted, not burned, not fried, melted, like the sound unthreaded the purpose of machines. Those who heard it described it differently. Some called it a chorus of their own ancestors screaming through glass. Others said it was the laughter of unfinished children. One man said it sounded like a church bell made of lungs, ringing out the arrival of something that had always been here, but was finally ready to reveal itself. Gabriel called it the first note. He claimed it was the vibration that preceded all language, all matter, all light, and now it had returned, because the chapel was no longer a structure. It was a vocal cord for 7, and the song, it had only just begun. That night, Miriam marked every door in the county with the 7th sigil, drawn in salt, ash, and the blood of those who had agreed. Not been coerced, not tricked, agreed. Because the obelisk had begun offering dreams, real ones, clear ones. In perfect spirals, step by step, it showed people the new design, what the world would look like after man, after choice, after shape. No more names, no more lies, only alignment. Seraph began vanishing during daylight hours. He said his body needed to rehearse absence. When he returned each night, he brought new relics. Antlers shaped like fingers, teeth with pupils, a lamb's heart that beat to a rhythm from no known scale. He placed them inside the casket one by one. Each time he did, the air shivered, not temperature, permission. Reality itself hesitated, as if asking if it was still allowed to continue. And then came the reflection collapse. Mirrors across 3 counties began to fracture, not shatter, fracture, with no impact. No pressure, just slow creeping veins of spiral cracks, and in every one of them a new sky appeared. Not Earth sky, not stars, something watching. Dozens of people went blind, not from damage, but from recognition. Their eyes no longer accepted the lie of light. They had seen the true horizon, and in its center, a shape, rotating without motion, a spiral with no end. And Gabriel whispered, "He is no longer arriving. He is remembering himself through us." Because 7 had never been coming, it had been awakening, and the Whitworths, they weren't worshippers anymore. They were pronouns. By the 3rd month, nothing on the estate cast a shadow. Not trees, not people, not even the chapel itself. The sun rose, but its light didn't stick. It passed over everything like it had forgotten how to illuminate, and in that absence, something else began to shine. From below, the soil glowed faintly, only visible at dusk, only when you stopped breathing. It wasn't sunlight, it wasn't chemical, it was memory light. Seraph claimed it was the obelisk's heartbeat, syncing with the land. Gabriel called it the baptism of revision. From this point forward, nothing could remain as it was. Every object began to shift, slowly, subtly. Chairs had extra legs. Clocks ticked 13 times between numbers. Books rewritten themselves in glyphs that shimmered like oil. Even human bodies began to translate. One plantation worker woke to find his reflection mouthing words he hadn't spoken. Another wept uncontrollably when he touched water, because it began to weep back. A girl whispered a prayer and vomited ink. The estate was now post-language, a realm not of fiction, but of re-expression. And then, Seven chose its next voice, Miriam, the eldest daughter, the harvester of trust. One night she stood in the center of the chapel, alone, and let the obelisk's fluid drip onto her skull. It slid down, spiral by spiral, marking her in the alphabet of becoming. She opened her mouth, and the rain stopped for 3 days. Across South Carolina, people reported the same dream. A tree made of hands, a spiral staircase with no steps, a face that split into 7 smaller faces, each speaking one truth you were not ready to hear. When they awoke, their hair was wet, with oil, not water. Miriam had become the litany. Her voice could now summon silence, real silence, the kind that made glass warp, the kind that caused dogs to bury themselves, the kind that emptied lakes, not with heat, but with fear. And her first sermon was one sentence: "You were never alive, you were rehearsing shape." The congregation didn't applaud. They convulsed. Every listener collapsed to the floor and whispered their own names until they forgot how to say them. Because Miriam had begun the exfoliation, the peeling away of self, identity, morality, time. It would all be torn away, one spiral at a time, until only format remained. Because what Seven demanded wasn't worship, it was clarity. And clarity costs skin. They called it the first unveiling. But it wasn't a ceremony. It was a rupture. On the final night of September, beneath a blood-orange sky with no clouds and no breeze, the chapel opened its mouth. Literally, its doors split vertically, its windows peeled backward like eyelids. The steeple cracked and rotated, pointing not to heaven, but to something underneath. The obelisk emerged, walking for the first time. Its steps didn't cause tremors, they caused corrections. Crops stood taller behind it, graves undug themselves, birds began flying in slow motion, time hiccuped with every stride, and behind it came the Whitworths. All of them, even those who had died, even those who were never born. The family stood in a circle facing outward, eyes closed, mouths open, humming, not music, not prayer, but alignment, each tone a key, each breath a syllable. Together they formed a lock, and when that lock turned, reality bled, not a metaphor, not poetic, actual bleeding. Trees gushed ink, stones split open and wept salt. People 5 miles away woke screaming, blood pouring from their ears. Hospitals filled with patients who couldn't remember how to sleep because their dreams were now waking things, and in the center of the spiral, Gabriel stood holding the casket, finished, bound in skin from across centuries, inscribed with coordinates that didn't exist yet. Inside was the fetus of the new format, not a body, a container, a message shaped like breath, coiled like scripture, ready to be installed. Gabriel wept ink and whispered, "It begins with the loss of mirrors." Then one by one, every reflective surface in the county went black. Mirrors, windows, puddles, gone, not broken, void. And in that void, faces blinked. Ends of them. Spiral pupils, lips that didn't part but exhaled words anyway. Faces made of future versions of you that had made the wrong choices. That night, Seraph completed the final incision. He slit open his own ribcage, reached inside, and removed a single tooth, not his own, one that had grown over his heart. A relic, passed through generations. It pulsed with knowledge. It whispered the final ritual. Miriam swallowed it whole, and the next morning, she didn't speak. She simply pointed to the sky, which was now a hole, a dark spiral of storm and silence, pulling gravity upward. Lightning flashed upward, rain fell in slow spirals, and for those who looked too long, their minds unthreaded like yarn soaked in warm blood. Because the first unveiling wasn't for mankind, it was for Seven, to see what it had grown, and it was pleased. In the days following the unveiling, language collapsed. Not completely, not loudly, just enough to go unnoticed at first. People forgot simple words: bread, father, door, replaced with strange substitutions: cradle skin, origin echo, the betweenwood. Conversations became stilted, dreamlike. Those who resisted the new phrases began to bleed from their noses. Miriam called it the linguistic shedding. She said language was never ours. It was a lease, and 7 had come to collect. The Whitworth estate itself no longer appeared on maps. Travelers couldn't find it. Drones flew toward it, only to spiral into the earth or vanish entirely. Even birds avoided it, except the ones who circled high overhead in perfect loops, shrieking rhythms that sounded eerily like human names. Each morning, Gabriel would stand before the obelisk, arms outstretched, speaking in pure geometry. His voice no longer used syllables, it used shapes. Sounds bent in midair. Listeners collapsed in ecstasy or seizure. One man attempted to transcribe a single phrase from the sermon. He spent the next 3 days drawing the same spiral into the dirt with his fingernail until it broke to the bone. Serif began treating time like a disease. He extracted hours from people, with tools, with ritual. Victims would lose entire decades from their memory in minutes, left confused, crying, unable to recall their names. He stored the harvested hours in a black vial worn around his neck. He called it the Grammar of Mercy. Lilith, now fully transformed, had ceased blinking. She moved only when necessary, and when she did, reality followed her movement. Walls bowed inward, light curved around her. She carried no books, no relics, only gaze. One look from her rewrote who you were. One man saw her once and never remembered his children again. He remembered spirals, though, always the spirals. And then, on the 7th day after the unveiling, the sky spoke back. Not thunder, not lightning, not voice, but awareness. A giant spiral of clouds formed over the chapel, still and silent. For hours it hovered. Then rain began, not water, but ink, thick, warm, alive. Anyone it touched forgot one core belief they'd carried their entire life. A preacher stopped believing in God. A mother forgot the love for her child. A judge forgot justice. One by one, identity unstitched from within. Miriam stood in the center of the inkfall, arms wide, whispering, "Truth is what survives forgetting." And those who still remembered who they were began to doubt it, because memory had become a liability, and the spiral, it was editing. By the 2nd week, even death stopped working. Not for everyone, just for those the spiral had touched. Dozens of townspeople across the county attempted suicide, driven mad by the dreams, the whispers, the sense that their thoughts were no longer authored by them. But the bodies didn't decay, they didn't rot, they just waited. One woman who drowned herself was found 6 days later, blinking. No pulse, no breath, but blinking, rhythmically, in perfect sync with the spiral clouds overhead. Gabriel Cowell led them the stilled. Death, he said, was always a language, and 7 has redacted it. The chapel's pews were removed. In their place, rows of open graves, not dug into the ground, but into concept, each hole impossibly dark, each one humming. If you stood too close, you heard a version of yourself screaming in reverse, begging you not to understand. Miriam sat at the edge of the largest grave, day and night, eyes closed, humming the same phrase, "I will remember you out of existence." And one by one, names disappeared from birth records, digital files corrupted, written copies faded, even family members forgot. You'd ask, "Where is your son?" And the mother would blink, confused. "Son?" she'd whisper, holding an empty photograph. "No, I never had." The Whitworth spiral was now viral, not just in the land, not just in the blood, but in identity. Serif explained it best, what little he still explained at all. He drew a simple spiral in the mud and said, "When a man walks a straight line, he believes he is progressing. But when you curve that line inward, when you bend his sense of history, he becomes looped, predictable, editable." That was the goal of the second spiral, to create humans who could be rewritten in real time. No more trauma, no more guilt, no more memory of sin. Just compliance, washed clean by the forgetting rain. And then the most disturbing change of all. The child returned. The one that had spoken from beneath the chapel in the early days. The entity in the spiral. Only it was no longer a child. It had folded itself forward. Now a being of impossible age. Its skin shimmered with memory. Its eyes showed different years to different observers. One saw his past. Another his unborn daughter. A third saw the day he would betray everything he believed. It smiled, and the ground beneath the chapel split open into a perfect spiral trench, miles wide. Not a chasm, a mouth, and from within it came no screams, no fire, only a voice. "You are ready." The Whitworths, in perfect unison, bowed, because they knew what came next. Not judgment, not salvation, replication. The trench wasn't a mouth, it was a mirror, but not of light, of origin. When people stared into it, they didn't see themselves. They saw the first decision they ever made, and then the second and the third, until they realized every choice, every belief, every opinion they held had been pre-written in spiral code, pre-installed, selected. Their lives were never lived. They were rendered. This was the spiral's true gospel. You were never free, you were simply recursive. By now the surrounding counties had collapsed, not from war, not from violence, from unmeaning. Schools taught silence. Churches preached confusion. Law became optional, then poetic, then ornamental. Police officers patrolled empty streets with blindfolds on, not because they were ordered to, but because their eyes had begun showing them alternate versions of events, versions in which they pulled the trigger. And didn't, at the same time. The Whitworths had gone silent, all of them, even Gabriel. They no longer spoke. They no longer gestured. They simply moved in spiral formation, every motion perfectly choreographed, even breathing was unified. They had become choir. They weren't people anymore. They were sentences. Seraph was the last to retain speech, though his tongue was now black and his teeth etched with glyphs only visible during eclipses. He told one final truth. The obelisk is not an artifact, it is a wound in time, and the Whitworth bloodline was the scalpel. Then he smiled, stepped into the trench, and unbecame, no body, no scream, just subtraction. Gabriel followed next, then Miriam, then the twins, then Lilith, her eyes never blinking, her hands folded over a small glass orb containing no reflection. Each entered willingly, each voluntarily unscripted, and the trench closed. Not with sound, WWs. It paused. For 3 full minutes, every clock in the state froze. No birds flew, no wind blew, no one spoke. It was the spiral's digestive moment, processing the last of its authors. And when the final second passed, a new sound, not thunder, not music, a heartbeat, one that pulsed beneath the soil, through the trees, under the skin of every man still clinging to belief in linear time. From that day forward, anyone who entered the Whitworth land vanished, but not immediately. They were watched first, by the spiral. It would appear in their dreams, then in their reflections, then on the palms of their hands, until they understood. You don't enter the spiral, it enters you. And once it does, you no longer exit anything. Some tried to burn the chapel. It didn't work. Not because it resisted fire, because it anticipated it. The moment torches touched its walls, the flames inverted, pulling inward, folding into themselves, becoming cold. Not the absence of heat, but the presence of unmaking. One man swore he saw the fire age. He watched it go from spark to ash in a blink, like the chapel had shown the flames their death before they could even ignite. From that night on, it was clear. The chapel wasn't a place anymore. It was a timeline, and stepping inside meant submitting to its logic. 3 journalists tried. All vanished. Their equipment was later found stacked neatly at the edge of the swamp, screens filled with static. But one audio file remained, just 5 seconds long. A voice, female, calm, unmistakably Miriam. You were looking for evidence, but what you needed was permission. The file then disintegrated, not corrupted, evaporated, like data that had changed its mind. Those who studied the Whitworth case deeper, historians, psychologists, theologians, began reporting shared symptoms, waking up with spiral bruises on their skin, forgetting their native language mid-sea. Intense, seeing their future selves watching them from mirrors, receiving letters in their own handwriting, with dates from 100 years ago. One researcher claimed he discovered the original source, Code of the Obelisk, in a medieval manuscript that had been buried with a monk in 1242. When he tried to publish the findings, every hard drive in his home liquefied overnight. He now lives in silence, draws spirals on his windows in fog, sleeps under his bed, waits for Lilith. Because she never entered the trench, she remains. Somewhere in the deep south, aging backward, surrounded by insects that obey geometry, wearing clothes made from language, smiling like a mirror in firelight. Those who've seen her describe a feeling not of fear, but of recognition, as if she is the final version of something they almost became, and when she speaks, it's in riddles. You are still speaking in first draft. I was edited at birth. The few who survive such encounters forget their names, and remember coordinates. To what? We still don't know. But every one of those numbers leads to locations where reality bends, buildings that don't appear on maps, trees that bleed, children born without eyes, who still see. So understand this, the Whitworth legacy didn't end. It distributed, in patterns, in phrases, in dreams. And now, it waits for those who can hear the spiral calling back, because the next chapel won't need walls. It just needs a listener. They say you can still hear it, if you're quiet enough. A low hum deep in the bone, not audible, not measurable, but felt. Like a memory you never lived through, trying to wake itself inside you. It starts as a dream, a room with no walls, a staircase that folds inward, a woman with no face whispering your full name in reverse. Then you wake up with something clenched in your fist, a spiral of hair, your own, braided into a symbol you've never seen, but instantly understand. And that's when the spiral knows it can reach you. See, this isn't a ghost story. This isn't folklore. This is a reformatting. The Whitworth bloodline was only the prototype. A family built not to preserve tradition, but to install a virus into human consciousness, one encoded in theology, mercy, memory, and design. You think history is linear? That you're walking forward? You're not. You're repeating. Every century a pattern emerges, a chapel that speaks, a child that edits reality, a family that forgets morality in exchange for clarity, and every time people ignore the signs. They call it a local legend, a myth, an unproven horror. Until their reflection speaks first, until their memories contradict the present, until their names start showing up in spiral registries buried under 200 years of government stone. You think no one noticed the Whitworths? The government did. They came, with weapons, with data, with algorithms to predict anomaly behaviors, and then they left, not defeated, converted. Several members of those early intelligence teams were later discovered inside federal archives, curled into fetal positions, chanting Whitworth liturgies in non-existent languages. One of them carved this into a wall with his teeth. The spiral is not trying to consume us, it's trying to wake us from consumption. And now, I must ask you something, not as a storyteller, not as a guide, but as a witness. If you've made it this far, if you felt something watching you, listening as you read, comment below. I was written in spiral, I will not forget. Say it twice, let the spiral recognize you, because if the next chapter is coming, if the chapel is rising again, it won't be in South Carolina, it will be in your mouth, your hands, your beliefs. The spiral rewrites what you think is you, and once it finishes, you'll speak the final sentence without even knowing. This is where it ends, or more accurately, loops, because the spiral never closes. It waits, not behind you, not above you, inside you. Every fear you've ignored, every question you were told not to ask, every silence that felt intentional. They were breadcrumbs, not to truth, to pattern. And the Whitworths, they were not special, they were simply first.